She was just slapped across the face, right there in first class, by a flight attendant who didn't think she belonged. No one stopped it, because to them, she was just another tired, old black woman in a wheelchair, too quiet to matter, too different to deserve respect. But what they didn't know, what no one on that flight knew, was that the moment her cheek stung, the game was already over. That woman? She wasn't just a passenger. She was holding a secret powerful enough to bring an entire airline to its knees. Before we show you how this one act of arrogance unraveled everything, tell us where in the world you're watching from right now. And if you've ever seen something that just felt wrong, drop it in the comments. We're reading them all. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with someone who still thinks silence is safer than standing up. Now watch closely, because the truth is about to take flight. Gloria Henderson waited quietly in the corner of the VIP boarding terminal, her hands folded neatly over the soft leather armrests of her wheelchair. At 76, with half her body weakened by time and illness, she had long since learned to spot the difference between silence born from patience and the kind born from being ignored. This was the latter. Her flight was scheduled to begin boarding in 20 minutes, yet despite two separate requests, no one had come to assist her onto the aircraft. She had paid extra for wheelchair service. She had even called the day before to reconfirm. But now, seated alone beneath the glowing Atlantic Sky Airlines logo, she could feel the stares from staff moving past her, acknowledging her only with fleeting glances, like she was a misplaced coat rack. Her voice, when it finally broke the silence, was calm but direct. "Excuse me, I need access to the lift, please." A young male attendant in a too-tight blazer barely slowed as he turned, his name badge catching the light. "Curtis. We're a little tied up right now," he said, gesturing vaguely toward a group of European businessmen sipping espresso in the lounge. "We've got priority guests coming through. I'll circle back when I can." He didn't wait for a response. Gloria watched him return to joking with a colleague, her expression unreadable. She didn't curse, didn't complain. She simply adjusted her scarf and waited. 10 more minutes passed before a soft-spoken female staffer finally approached, cheeks red with embarrassment as she said, "Ma'am, I can help you get to the gate now. Sorry for the delay." "You're very kind," Gloria replied, her tone gentle but steady. "Thank you." As they moved through the jet bridge, Gloria caught glimmers of conversation ahead. Laughter, glass clinking. A crew of uniformed attendants hovered by the aircraft door, greeting passengers with robotic warmth. But when Gloria rolled forward, their energy shifted. One of them, Darla Mason, slim, late 30s, sharp features hardened by too many years, believing the world owed her obedience, stepped into her path. "Name?" Darla asked briskly. "Gloria Henderson," she answered, handing over her boarding pass. Darla scanned it, blinked, then glanced again, her lips pressing into a thin, forced smile. "Seat 1A?" she asked, voice rising just enough to draw glances. "Yes," Gloria said simply. "Is there a problem?" Darla tapped her screen, then looked back at Gloria. "This seat's in our premium flagship suite section." "I'm aware. I booked it." "You did." The words came laced with disbelief. Darla didn't ask for ID. She didn't offer assistance to help Gloria board. She just stared, then tilted her head with mock concern. "Are you sure you meant to book this class? It's usually reserved for our high-tier elite clients." "I am a high-tier elite client," Gloria said evenly. "Check the record." Darla hesitated, thumb hovering over her tablet, then quickly flicked the screen and shook her head. "I'm going to need to double-check something with the front desk." Gloria watched her disappear into the jetway. From behind her, the next few passengers, wealthy, polished, white, were ushered in with big smiles and flowing champagne flutes. The difference in treatment was stark. When Darla returned 5 minutes later, she didn't meet Gloria's eyes. Instead, she stepped aside and motioned toward the rear of the plane. "Ma'am, there's been a seating error. I'll need you to wait in the economy lounge area while we sort it out." Gloria narrowed her eyes slightly. "That won't be necessary. You're not listed in our upgrade tier." "I didn't upgrade." I paid full fare. Darla folded her arms, voice sharpening. Passengers needing extra assistance are typically seated in the rear for logistical reasons. You must have been misassigned. Misassigned by whom? Gloria asked. The system, Darla said too quickly. It happens. Only to people like me? Gloria's tone didn't rise, but the words cut like glass. Around them, murmurs began spreading among other travelers. One man nearby leaned to his wife and whispered, "What's going on?" The woman shushed him, eyes locked on the unfolding tension. Gloria tapped her boarding pass. "Do you intend to block me from taking my seat?" Darla's jaw tensed. "I'm asking you to be reasonable. I'm asking you to follow your company's policies." Darla took a breath, then stepped back. "You can wait by the curtain until I check with the gate manager." Gloria nodded slowly, wheeling herself to the side. She was no stranger to these games. She had faced them in restaurants, hotels, courtrooms, even churches. And in every one of them, the real fight had never been about a seat. It was about being seen, being acknowledged, being treated as a person with dignity. As she waited, two young male passengers in suits boarded. One glanced at her and smirked, as if amused by the sight of a black elderly woman in a wheelchair occupying first-class space. The other ignored her entirely. Gloria sat still, but her mind was active, calculating. Her name was printed on every financial document tied to this flight. She held equity in the airline. Her late husband had built the initial investment fund. She'd simply never needed to wave her title in anyone's face. Not until now. A voice crackled over the cabin intercom. "Pre-boarding is now complete. First-class service begins shortly." Gloria rolled back slightly to see Darla whispering to another attendant by the galley. One of them shot her a glance, then quickly looked away. Darla returned, still with no apology. "You'll need to move back to 16C. It's an aisle seat." "I won't," Gloria said. "This is my seat." Darla's voice turned icy. "Then I'll have to call the air marshal." Gloria smiled faintly. "Go ahead. But before you do, you might want to check who signed the checks around here." For the first time, Darla blinked in confusion. "Excuse me." "Look up the ownership structure of Atlantic Sky Holdings," Gloria said softly. "You'll find the name Henderson printed very high on the ledger." A long silence passed between them. Then Darla straightened, clearly flustered, but still clinging to her pride. "I'll double-check with the gate." "Please do." Gloria didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She had planted the first seed. And from here, things were about to grow. Darla hadn't returned with any manager, nor had she confirmed a single word Gloria had said. The atmosphere around them had shifted, first into tension, then into quiet unease, as other first-class passengers observed the exchange while pretending not to. Gloria could feel their stares, the subtle tightening of smiles, the occasional side glance, each one more a judgment than a question. A few rows down, a middle-aged man with a Rolex and a navy linen suit leaned across his wife and whispered something that made her lips twitch into a disapproving smirk. Darla, now back at her station near the galley, moved with tight, snappy gestures, checking overhead bins and ignoring Gloria completely, even as she passed within inches. She handed out water to the other first-class guests, flashing them professional smiles and soft reassurances about the flight. When she reached row 1, where Gloria was seated just beside the aisle, her entire demeanor cooled to ice. Gloria sat with dignity, her boarding pass clipped beside her seat as she waited for the inevitable escalation. Darla turned sharply, carrying a silver tray with 2 crystal glasses of sparkling water, one of which she offered to Mr. and Mrs. Raymond in 1B and 1C, her voice dripping with pleasantries. Then she turned toward Gloria. Without warning, her wrist flicked, and a cold stream of water sloshed directly onto Gloria's slacks and coat sleeve. The water splashed in a deliberate arc across her lap, staining the fine fabric and darkening it instantly. The shock was immediate, not in Gloria's expression, which remained composed, but in the audible gasps that echoed from several rows behind. "Oh my," Darla said flatly, not even attempting to disguise the act. You should really be careful where you put your hands, ma'am. These seats are brand new. Gloria glanced down at the spreading water, then up at Darla, her voice quiet but firm. That was no accident. Darla smiled coldly. You've been gripping the armrest like you're hanging on for dear life. I'm just making sure it stays clean. From the far side of first class, a young woman in business attire muttered, did she just pour that on her, while her seatmate leaned forward for a better look. A few heads turned toward the cockpit, as if expecting someone in authority to intervene. But no one came. Gloria calmly dabbed her coat with a napkin, her hand never shaking. If you wanted me to leave this seat, she said softly, you could have just asked. You've already been asked, Darla snapped, her voice rising a notch. Now you're disrupting the cabin, and I will not tolerate that. Gloria's eyes narrowed slightly. Disrupting? I've said nothing. I've done nothing. I've simply sat in the seat I paid for. Darla leaned in closer, lowering her voice, but letting the venom drip from every syllable. This is a privateer, ma'am. Not just anyone can sit here. Not for show. Not to prove some kind of point. Gloria didn't move. And who exactly do you think I am? Darla exhaled sharply, her patience spent. Someone who clearly doesn't know their place. That moment, the exact phrase, uttered without hesitation, rippled through the cabin like a gunshot. A man in 3D stood up halfway. Hey, come on now, he said. You can't talk to her like that. Darla shot him a withering glance. This doesn't concern you, sir. Gloria turned toward the passenger, giving him a brief nod of gratitude, then looked back at Darla. You've made quite an assumption about who I am, she said. But I assure you, that mistake will be yours alone. Darla straightened, eyes blazing, and without warning, lifted her open palm and slapped Gloria across the face. The sound, a sharp, sickening crack, snapped through the air. Passengers gasped, someone shouted, and another stood up in full. Are you kidding me? A woman yelled from 2F. She just hit her. Gloria didn't cry out. She didn't even flinch. Her cheek turned red instantly, but her gaze remained steady, unblinking. Her voice came in a whisper. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. Darla's hands shook slightly, her adrenaline spiking as the reality of what she'd done began to set in. But she masked it quickly, retreating into her false authority. You've been hostile since you boarded, she barked. This is a federal flight. I will have security remove you if you raise your voice again. I haven't raised it once, Gloria replied, her voice still low and level. But if you'd like to call security, please do. Just know they'll be detaining the wrong person. More passengers were on their feet now. The man from 3D had his phone out. I recorded that, he announced. Everything. The water. The slap. You'd better rethink this. Darla's face flushed a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. Her composure cracked, just for a second, as she turned and stormed toward the cockpit to summon the lead flight officer. In her absence, the cabin buzzed with conversation. Cell phones out, people murmuring, "Did you see her face? And what the hell is happening?" Around her, whispers swelled like rising water. Passengers murmuring in disbelief, shifting in their seats, sneaking glances in her direction, and glancing toward their phones. In row 3D, the man who had recorded the slap, later identified by his boarding pass as Aaron Blake, a tech consultant from San Diego, was scrolling through the footage, his thumb poised above the screen, contemplating whether to post it or simply show it to the crew. His partner beside him leaned in and whispered urgently, "Send it. This is wrong." But just before he could act, Darla returned, her expression tight and rehearsed, now flanked by the co-pilot, a younger man in his early 30s with neatly parted blonde hair, whose badge read J. Kramer. His face held a smile that didn't reach his eyes, the kind of neutral detachment that said, "This isn't my problem unless it disrupts takeoff." "Ladies and gentlemen," Darla began, her voice a tone lower than usual, but still commanding attention, "we ask for your discretion and understanding as we handle a passenger issue. There's no cause for concern. Please refrain from taking or distributing unauthorized photos or videos, as it violates FAA guidelines." Her eyes locked directly onto Aaron Blake, her voice dropping an octave. "Sir, I saw you recording earlier. I'm going to have to ask you to delete that footage immediately." Aaron's jaw tightened. Why? You assaulted her. This is public interest. Darla's lips curled into a practiced smile. Recording crew members during a flight-related conflict is considered a breach of aviation safety protocols. I could have the marshal speak with you directly. You assaulted her, Aaron repeated, his voice louder now. That wasn't safety. That was assault. Darla took a step closer. Sir, you're escalating. I'm asking you once politely to comply. If not, I will need to involve security when we land. Aaron hesitated. His partner nudged him. Babe, just save it to the cloud. He did, quickly backing it up with a few taps, then tucked the phone away. Gloria turned her head just slightly and offered him a brief nod of acknowledgement. She saw what he had done, and she wouldn't forget it. Meanwhile, co-pilot Kramer stepped forward, addressing Gloria directly now, his tone smooth and corporate. Ma'am, we've reviewed the situation. I understand there's been some tension, but I'd like to move past it so we can depart safely and without further incident. Is that right? Gloria asked softly. And what part of the incident are we moving past? The water or the strike? Kramer hesitated, clearly not expecting a direct challenge. Well, ma'am, sometimes misunderstandings happen in tight spaces. Crew are trained to handle disruptions, and occasionally they must act decisively when a situation escalates. Gloria's smile was faint, almost pitying. You call this escalation? I haven't raised my voice, haven't moved from my seat. I've been insulted, soaked, and slapped, and yet you stand here telling me it's a misunderstanding. Kramer shifted uneasily. With all due respect, ma'am, I've seen what your respect looks like, Gloria interrupted. It looks like silence when a black disabled woman is assaulted in plain view of 10 witnesses. The cabin had gone quiet again, passengers hanging on every word. A few avoided eye contact, suddenly interested in their magazines or phones, unwilling to pick a side. Others nodded subtly, but still remained seated, silent. Cowards in comfortable leather chairs. Kramer straightened, then gave a small shrug. Let's just all calm down. No need to create a bigger issue than it is. We're all trying to get to our destinations. Gloria's eyes narrowed. You're right about one thing, Mr. Kramer. We are all going somewhere. The only difference is, some of us aren't coming back the same. He blinked, caught off guard by the weight of her words, then turned to Darla, muttering, Let's just push the service forward. Get her settled. Darla exhaled with forced calm. As I said before, if this passenger refuses to move to her reassigned seat in economy, I'll be forced to call ground security before takeoff. She looked around now, addressing the cabin. We can't proceed until this is resolved. No one moved. No one spoke. Finally, a woman in 2C, a retired educator from Atlanta, spoke up. You're holding up the flight over your own mistake. Darla ignored her. Gloria leaned slightly forward and looked at her with clinical precision. Call security if you must. But before you do, I want you to remember this moment, the moment you decided to turn a mistake into a scandal. Darla's eyes flickered. Something in her posture shifted, like she felt the edge of something sharp pressing against her pride. But still, she refused to relent. She turned and walked briskly toward the galley once more. As she vanished behind the curtain, Aaron reached forward again. I've got the video backed up, he whispered to Gloria. You want me to send it to someone? Gloria gave him a faint smile. Not yet. Let's give them another chance to do the right thing. But inside, she already knew they wouldn't. Not unless they were forced. Just beyond the bulkhead curtain, Darla stood beside the captain, whispering fast and low. The captain, a silver-haired man with decades in the air, listened, arms crossed. He didn't ask for the passenger manifest. He didn't ask for video. He didn't ask for the truth. When she finished, he exhaled and said, Handle it quietly. These types always create scenes. We can't afford more delays. Understood, Darla said, satisfied. I'll get her off before we taxi. Her thumb hovered over the keypad for a second before she dialed, the sound of each button pressing, soft yet final. She held the phone to her ear as the call connected without hesitation, and when the voice on the other end answered, she spoke only 6 words. They're doing it again. it's time." Then she ended the call, tucked the phone back into her pocket, and calmly adjusted the cuffs of her coat like nothing had happened. From row 3D, Aaron Blake caught the quiet, cryptic exchange and leaned slightly toward his partner. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. She didn't ask for help. She issued a command. In the galley, Darla continued her hushed conversation with the captain, smugly reporting that Gloria remained non-compliant. The captain nodded with indifference. "Get it handled. Fast." But before Darla could return to the cabin, her earpiece chirped. A secure channel buzzing with a sharp tone reserved only for internal executive alerts. "Control to Cabin Chief Mason." The voice crackled through her earpiece, causing her to stiffen. "Flight 722 is now flagged for priority monitoring. Effective immediately. Full cabin behavior is under live review by the Executive Division. All personnel are advised to exercise protocol-level compliance." Darla froze. "Repeat, please," she said, voice suddenly dry. The voice came again, clearer and colder this time. "You've been escalated. Orders came directly from HQ. The chairman's office has eyes on your manifest." Darla blinked. She'd never heard anything like it before. Corporate escalation from the chairman's suite? That never happened. It was used for hijackings, threats, or high-level breaches, not boarding disputes. She turned toward the cockpit, her face paling. "Captain, you need to hear this." She replayed the message. The captain's jaw tightened, and a flicker of discomfort crept into his expression for the first time. "Did they say chairman's office?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Darla nodded, suddenly less certain, her grip tightening on the panel's edge. In the first-class cabin, Gloria remained still, sipping a glass of water someone else, not Darla, had finally brought her. Around her, the air changed. The tension, once clinging and oppressive, began to shift, like a pressure drop before a storm. People could sense something was happening, even if they couldn't name it. Aaron looked at his phone again. Within minutes, he received a push notification from a friend at the aviation blog he followed. "Hey," he whispered, turning to his partner. "Atlantic Sky just flagged a high-level incident on this flight. It's in the back-end system. That never goes public unless someone up top is watching." At the front of the plane, Darla returned, shoulders squared, but movements more cautious now. She approached Gloria's row with what she imagined was a collected tone, but the fear behind her eyes betrayed her. "Ma'am," she began, the forced professionalism returning to her voice like a mask. "There's been an update. We're reviewing your seat assignment again." "It may have been. Don't bother," Gloria said, not unkindly, but with the finality of a judge delivering sentence. "You've already told me enough. I just wanted to give you a chance to stop before it became something bigger." Darla's mouth opened, then closed again. She looked like a woman walking toward a cliff, suddenly aware the ground was ending. "Is there someone you'd like me to speak with?" she asked, trying a different tactic. "Someone at corporate?" Gloria turned her head slowly, locking eyes with her. "You're already speaking to the right people. You just don't know it yet." At that moment, a chime echoed from the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain." The voice came over the PA, stiff and unnatural. "We've been advised of a supervisory review on this flight. Please remain in your seats while we confirm some administrative adjustments." In the cockpit, the captain stared at the flashing red alert on his terminal. "Who the hell is on this plane?" he muttered. Back in 3D, Aaron could barely suppress his grin. "I think we just found out who owns the damn company," he whispered. His partner's eyes widened. "Her." "I don't know how," Aaron said, "but that call she made, it went somewhere important. This isn't about her ticket anymore." Gloria remained unmoved, her gaze drifting toward the window, watching the tarmac lights shimmer like distant stars. She thought of her late husband and the founding papers they signed together when the airline was nothing more than a 5-person dream. She had never needed recognition. She didn't need applause. She had built legacy, and legacy didn't scream. It whispered until the world had no choice but to listen. Darla stood awkwardly for a moment longer before slowly retreating toward the galley, where she found the co-pilot staring at a monitor filled with blinking warnings. "What now?" she asked him, voice low. "I don't know," he said honestly. But if the chairman's office is watching, it means someone on board has a direct line to the top. It's the woman, Darla said. It has to be. Then you better pray you didn't hit the wrong one, he replied, his voice hollow. Darla looked away, but the damage was already done. The passengers parted silently, instinctively, like the sea pulling away from an incoming tide. No one questioned her now. No one dared. Darla watched her go, but made no move to intervene, her eyes filled with a cocktail of disbelief, regret, and rising panic. When Gloria disappeared behind the lavatory door, the tension that had suffused the first-class cabin seemed to tighten into a single, breathless pause. That pause shattered seconds later when a man seated in 2D, mid-30s, olive skin, wearing jeans, a light jacket, and the kind of posture that said, "I'm watching, but I don't want you to know," stood up and reached calmly into his inner pocket. He pulled out a black leather badge wallet, flipped it open just long enough for the passengers closest to him to see the unmistakable golden seal. Federal Bureau of Investigation. "I need to speak with the flight captain," he said, his voice low but authoritative. "Now." Darla blinked at him, stunned. I don't understand. Are you on duty?" "I am now," he said. "Special Agent Ryan Greer, Internal Civil Rights Division. I'm not here by accident." That was the moment the air went out of the room. The man next to him, who had been silently flipping through a magazine, sat up straighter. Someone gasped audibly in 3A. Aaron Blake whispered, "Holy hell," but no one else said a word. Greer stepped into the galley, where the captain stood hunched over the monitor. "You have a problem," Greer said. "That woman you've been harassing? You're not just dealing with a customer. You're dealing with a federal witness in an open investigation into racial discrimination patterns across multiple airlines, including this one." The captain's face drained of color. "Why wasn't I briefed?" "You weren't meant to be," Greer replied. "This was a soft audit, anonymous observation. But after what just occurred, and the fact that the chairman's office intervened directly, I'm activating my authority." "You're saying this was entrapment?" the captain asked weakly. "No," Greer said. "I'm saying you failed." Meanwhile, behind the lavatory door, Gloria steadied herself before the mirror. She wiped the side of her face with a cool towel, letting the faint sting of Darla's slap fade beneath the firmer sensation of resolve. Her reflection looked back with quiet fire, eyes that had witnessed decades of struggle, policy battles, courtroom warfare, and institutional betrayal. She opened her bag and pulled out a worn leather card holder containing a faded ID, Gloria E. Henderson, investigative journalist, National Civil Liberty Watch. She had once stood at the steps of the Supreme Court with a microphone in one hand and a sealed deposition in the other, exposing one of the largest housing discrimination scams in the country. She had worked under aliases, embedded herself in corrupted systems, infiltrated offices, interviewed victims, filed federal lawsuits under protection of whistleblower laws. She had broken stories that toppled police chiefs, mayors, even governors. And then, after decades of fighting for others, she had retired from the public eye, choosing silence not out of defeat, but because she knew power was best wielded from the shadows. Until now. This wasn't a retirement trip. This was a test. She was never just a passenger. She was the fire at the end of the matchstick, and tonight someone had struck it. When she emerged from the restroom minutes later, every eye turned to her, not with suspicion, but with recognition. Not the kind that came from knowing a name, but the instinctive human knowledge of presence, of weight, of gravity. Aaron Blake stood. "Ma'am," he said, "is there anything we could do?" "You've already done enough," she replied, smiling at him. "You saw. You didn't look away. That matters." Darla now stood to the side, her previous confidence gone, eyes flickering between Gloria, the captain, and the man with the badge. The FBI agent approached Gloria and gave a subtle nod. "Ma'am," he said respectfully. "You good to continue?" "Yes," Gloria said, her voice smooth. "But I think it's time the rest of them knew who they're dealing with." "We're already preparing the statement," Greer replied. "The review team is on standby." The captain, pale and sweating, attempted one last act of authority. "We can't allow statements mid-flight. It's procedure." "No," Gloria said. stepping past him and turning to face the first-class cabin. "What you call procedure is what allowed people like her," she nodded toward Darla, "to operate unchecked for years. You covered for her. You looked away. And you convinced yourself it was about policy, not prejudice. But let me be perfectly clear. That ends tonight." The cabin was silent, but the energy had shifted completely. Gloria turned, took her seat again, and folded her hands neatly in her lap. "Let's continue the flight," she said. "But let's make sure the next chapter of this story doesn't get edited out." Agent Greer turned to Darla and said flatly, "You'll remain seated. When we land, you'll be met by federal investigators. If you so much as raise your voice again, I'll consider it obstruction." As the cabin slowly absorbed the reality that the woman they had dismissed, ignored, and mistreated was not just another elderly traveler, but a powerful force quietly working behind the curtain of the very system they relied on, a new notification arrived on the captain's secure console. It came with a priority override code, flashing red and marked as board-level alert. "Ownership verification required." Captain Evans hesitated as he read the line that followed. "Confirm immediate recognition of passenger. G.E. Henderson, alias linked to T.G. Holdings." His fingers trembled slightly as he tapped into the secure manifest override channel. He had only seen that code once, during a high-clearance military charter in his early years. The terminal loaded the full registration file. The screen blinked. Then it revealed the real name tied to the registration and controlling interest of the airline: Tyler Gloria Graves. The captain stared at the name for a full 5 seconds. He'd flown for Atlantic Sky for over 22 years. He had heard rumors, whispers of a private, anonymous equity firm that quietly backed the airline from its infancy. A holding group so private no one ever publicly confirmed its board makeup. But now, staring at the screen, he understood what had been hidden in plain sight. G.E. Henderson wasn't just a VIP. She wasn't just a founder. She was the architect of the company's values, the original investor who rescued the airline from collapse during its second year. She was the founder's mother, or rather, she was the founder. The full name appeared again in legal capital letters: Tyler Gloria Graves, an alias used to mask gender and identity during the early capital rounds. All internal routes designated for anonymous audits fell under her control. The realization struck like a punch to the gut. She hadn't just been mistreated. She had come to test them, and they had failed miserably. Meanwhile, back in first class, Gloria sat with an elegance that defied the turbulence of recent events. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing slowly, letting the ripple of power shift around her without a single word. The flight had just crossed into cruise altitude, but on the ground, a flurry of activity ignited across Atlantic Sky's headquarters. Compliance officers were pulled from sleep. Legal advisors were patched into emergency calls. A memo circulated with lightning speed: "Do not interfere. Observe only. Graves in cabin." Inside the plane, Agent Greer had received the same notice through a secured channel. He turned toward the captain, whose face had turned pale and hollow. "You got the update?" Greer asked, already knowing the answer. The captain nodded slowly. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I swear to God, I didn't know." "That's the point," Greer said. "She never wanted you to." Darla remained seated, her posture rigid, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of her seat. She had received no updates, only the growing silence from the chain of command that had once enabled her to act with impunity. The hierarchy she'd relied on, her perceived authority, was crumbling with every passing second. Gloria finally opened her eyes and turned to the passenger beside her, a young woman in her 20s who had said nothing all flight. "You look like someone who's witnessed enough to understand silence is power," Gloria said gently. The girl nodded, wide-eyed. "I've never seen anyone do what you just did." "It wasn't just me," Gloria replied. "The truth only works if others recognize it when they see it." From a cockpit, the captain emerged slowly, approaching Gloria's row like a man walking to his own sentencing. He paused before her, straightened his uniform, and removed his hat. "Ma'am," he said, voice low and full of shame, I'd like to offer my personal apology. I didn't recognize who you were." Gloria looked up at him and smiled faintly. "That's the problem, Captain. You never needed to recognize me. You only needed to recognize what was wrong." His face tightened with guilt, but he said nothing. He simply bowed his head and turned to leave. Gloria's eyes followed him for a moment before glancing down at her phone, where a message had arrived from HQ. It simply read, "All units notified. Disciplinary audit authorized. Proceed at your discretion." She tucked the phone away. Across the aisle, Darla sat frozen, her mind spiraling as the pieces fell into place. The woman she had insulted, struck, and dismissed was the unseen force behind the very seat she once guarded so viciously. The idea of superiority she had built her career around was a lie, now exposed, now shattering in the same first-class cabin where she had once ruled like a queen. Agent Greer stood and made a quiet announcement to the front cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. A personnel matter is being addressed. There is no danger, and your cooperation has been appreciated. Please enjoy the remainder of your flight." As he sat, he leaned toward Gloria again. "You've built something they can't even comprehend. I've been assigned to corporate discrimination cases for 6 years, and I've never seen a maneuver like this." Gloria smiled softly. They thought they were policing the cabin. What they never realized was this cabin polices them. Greer chuckled, then glanced toward the cockpit. "You planning on saying anything else?" "Not yet," Gloria replied. "Let them sit with the silence. Let it shake their bones." The isolation stung worse than reprimand. Her earpiece had gone dead minutes ago. No one was protecting her now. Around her, the dynamic had shifted entirely. No one deferred to her anymore. No one made eye contact. She had become what she feared most, an irrelevant voice in a cabin she no longer controlled. Then, from 3 rows back, a familiar whisper caught her ear. "That's her," a passenger muttered to her seatmate. "The one who hit the old woman. She thought no one would care." Darla's eyes flared, her jaw clenched, and she sprang to her feet, her voice rising sharply, without thought. "You don't know what it's like." The sentence rang through the air like a spark hitting gasoline. A wave of stunned silence washed over the cabin. Gloria, who had been quietly writing something on a notepad, looked up, calm and composed, but didn't speak. Agent Greer stood slightly from his seat, his hand resting near his badge, his expression unreadable. Darla took one step forward, facing the galley wall, her back to the passengers as she exhaled hard, her voice cracking with frustration and something darker beneath it. "I have to keep order in this cabin," she snapped. "I've worked my way up from nothing while catering to people who don't appreciate the rules. People like her, who think they're special just because they pull some card." Her voice was shaking now, her filter fully gone. "I'm sick of being talked down to. I'm sick of being told I'm wrong just because someone has money or a sob story or a cane." She came in here like she owned the place. Another pause. Then the sentence that shattered what little was left of her reputation. "I'm tired of having to serve people like her." The words dropped with the weight of finality. The quiet that followed was no longer confusion. It was horror. Gasps cut through the air like blades. Someone whispered, "Oh my God," behind a cupped hand. Gloria didn't react. She didn't have to. Truth had just walked through the door uninvited and spoken in Darla's own voice. But Darla, too far gone, turned around, defiant in her unraveling. "What?" she barked. "You're all thinking it. You sit there judging me. But you didn't say a word until she made that call. None of you even cared until it became inconvenient." "We're recording this," Aaron Blake announced, standing now with his phone raised high. "Every word. You just confessed to prejudice in front of over 30 passengers." Darla blinked, suddenly registering what was happening. "You can't, this isn't allowed. FAA prohibits filming crew." "The FAA prohibits abuse of passengers," Agent Greer countered. "And you just made my case airtight." Another voice chimed in, a teenage girl seated in 4B, holding up her phone with a red light blinking. "We're live right now. You're trending." "What?" Darla said, eyes wide. "Trending." The girl nodded. 300,000 watching. And that's just TikTok. This isn't legal. Darla screamed, now panicking. You can't put this online. You're invading my privacy. You gave up that right the second you raised your hand against someone you thought couldn't fight back, Gloria said quietly, not even raising her voice. And now the world is watching the kind of person you are when you think no one's watching. A minute later, Aaron received a ping. His video had been clipped, posted, and reshared across 5 major platforms. Views were climbing by the thousands every second. Headlines had already begun to form. Flight attendant slaps elderly black woman, didn't know she owned the airline. Prejudice at 30,000 feet, the fall of Darla Mason. Federal agent, hidden founder, and a slap heard around the world. Darla slumped back into the jump seat. Her confidence imploded, her breath uneven. She looked toward the cockpit for support, but even the captain refused to meet her eyes. The flight attendants who once worked beside her now kept their distance, saying nothing. No rescue would come. Across the aisle, passengers opened apps, retweeted posts, commented in real time. She said it herself, someone typed. She said she was tired of serving people like her. I don't care if it's against policy. Another post read. I'm glad we saw this. This is how things change. Gloria glanced down at her notepad again. She had written only one line, and she now folded the paper and tucked it into her bag. The note read, Silence protects the powerful. As the murmurs of shock and disgust spread through the cabin like wildfire, and the clip of Darla's meltdown continued to explode across social media, Gloria finally reached into her carry-on and pulled out a sleek, matte black tablet with an embossed gold emblem on the back, an old but unmistakable signature logo, the kind seen only by those at the top of corporate power structures. She tapped in a code with a practiced hand, and the screen lit up with a secure login page. The words Tyler Graves Holdings, Executive Operations Access, glowed faintly against the glass. Nearby, Agent Greer noticed and leaned in slightly, just enough to glimpse the authorization tier, his brows lifting when he saw the clearance level marked in red. Level 0 Founding Authority, Override. It was the kind of access reserved only for the highest rung of ownership, unappealable, unquestioned, absolute. Gloria didn't look up as she navigated through the system with quiet efficiency. Her fingers moved deliberately, first opening the airline's internal HR dashboard, then accessing the Disciplinary Operations module, then pulling up the crew manifest for Flight 722. Every click echoed like a verdict already written. The passengers, sensing something monumental was about to happen, grew silent again. Even the air felt heavier, as if the pressurization system itself had paused to listen. Gloria cleared her throat gently, then spoke, not loud, not angry, but with a tone carved from stone. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, you've all just witnessed what happens when those entrusted with safety, dignity, and decency forget who they serve and why. Darla shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her face a blend of disbelief and dread. The captain remained frozen at the front, the tablet screen from earlier still displayed in the cockpit, silently confirming what Gloria was about to say. This airline was born in a garage, Gloria continued. 2 decades ago, my son Tyler Graves had a dream and $3,000 to his name. No investors, no runway, just a vision of creating a company that treated people like people, not statistics. She paused, letting the weight of that settle in before delivering the truth that stunned even the ones who thought they already knew. He didn't build it alone. I did. I mortgaged my home, sold my jewelry, and poured everything I had into this airline. Not for profit, for principle. Because I was tired of seeing the same people overlooked, passed over, and humiliated by those who believed their uniform gave them the right to measure a person's worth. She tapped once more and brought up the live crew status. 3 names blinked in yellow: Darla Mason, Captain George Evans, and Flight Manager Rachel Nolan. Gloria selected all 3, pressed hold, and confirmed with fingerprint authorization. A loading circle spun briefly, then turned green. The word suspension order issued. Effective immediately flashed on screen. As of this moment, Gloria said clearly, Miss Mason, Captain Evans, and MS Nolan are hereby suspended pending a formal review of their actions aboard this flight. All access credentials are revoked. You are no longer operating under this company's authority." A wave of gasps swept through the cabin. Darla stood, panic rising. "You can't do that. You can't suspend me. I just did," Gloria said flatly, without even looking at her. "You violated 3 clauses of our employee conduct agreement, 2 of FAA's customer rights protections, and 1 basic principle of humanity." The captain emerged slowly from the cockpit, face pale, voice barely audible. "Ma'am, I didn't mean—" "You didn't stop it," Gloria replied. That was enough. The remaining attendants stepped back, watching silently as power reconfigured itself before their eyes. No one dared intervene now. Agent Greer folded his arms and nodded with grim satisfaction. "I'll ensure those suspensions are enforced on the ground," he said, "and I'll make sure their licenses don't outlast their careers." A man in 3C clapped once. Then another joined. Then a ripple of applause spread across the cabin, quiet at first, then stronger, less for spectacle and more for acknowledgement, respect, and the undeniable authority that had just reshaped their understanding of justice. Gloria waited until the applause faded before she continued. "I didn't want to do this here," she said. "I came on this flight as part of our annual integrity check, an unannounced review of how we treat people when we think they have no power." Her gaze moved to each corner of the cabin. "What I found today isn't just a failure. It's a betrayal of everything we built. But I want you to understand something. This story will not end in silence." Her fingers moved again, opening the airline's internal broadcast system. She selected all flights/staff notification/CEO priority channel and began typing. Effective immediately, a full review of staff conduct procedures and cultural training will commence. Any report of discriminatory behavior will trigger automatic audit. This is not a warning. This is a standard. She pressed send. The system confirmed delivery. "I believe in redemption," she said, looking toward Darla one last time. "But redemption begins with accountability. And for you, that begins today." Darla sat down hard, no longer able to form words. Her hands trembled as she realized the full scope of what had been unleashed, not just a career-ending scandal, but a legacy-level correction authored by the very woman she tried to diminish. Gloria turned back to the window, her expression softening slightly, the fury beneath her voice replaced with quiet grace. "Let's finish this flight." A man in 2A, dressed in khaki and button-downs, stood and cleared his throat. "I run a law firm in Atlanta," he said. "I've represented employment discrimination cases for 20 years. And I've never seen such a precise, deliberate act of accountability. You reminded us all what leadership looks like." Then a woman in 4C raised her hand slightly. She had short cropped hair, reading glasses, and a laptop still open on her tray. "My name is Rachel Amara," she said. "I'm with CNN. I was on this flight for an assignment in Chicago, but I think I've just found the real story. If you'd allow me, ma'am, I'd like to speak with you when we land." Gloria gave her a gentle nod. "Only if you report the whole truth, not just the scandal, but the silence that made it possible." Rachel nodded solemnly. "That's exactly what I intend to do." In the rows behind them, passengers began applauding again, not the hesitant claps from before, but genuine, visceral support. Some called out words of thanks, some offered their business cards, and a few simply placed their hands over their hearts in solidarity. It was no longer about class or convenience or flight paths. It was about one woman holding a mirror up to a system and demanding that everyone see what they'd been too comfortable to notice. Meanwhile, thousands of feet below, in the downtown office tower that housed Atlantic Sky's executive board, the aftershocks had already begun. A red line emergency alert had triggered a midnight notification to all 11 board members. Within 30 minutes, they were gathered on a secure video conference, each of their faces tight with concern. The chairman of the board, an aging venture capitalist named Darnell Foster, sat stone-faced in his dimly lit study, watching the viral video for the 3rd time. The audio was clear, the visuals damning. Darla's voice saying she was tired of serving people like her, followed by Gloria calmly suspending the entire flight crew with a fingerprint scan. The boardroom fell silent as he finished playing the clip. "Well," Foster said, That's going to be on every screen in the country by morning. One of the board members, a younger woman in her 30s, finally spoke. We can't treat this like a PR crisis. This is systemic. The fact that Gloria had to go undercover to prove what we should have seen ourselves, she shouldn't have had to, another added. This isn't the first complaint. It's just the first one we couldn't bury. Foster rubbed his eyes and leaned forward. I want an emergency audit of every domestic and international flight crew in the past 6 months. I want all flagged complaints pulled, reviewed, and categorized by resolution type. Any pattern of bias, race, disability, gender, gets its own task force by 9 a.m. And the crew from this flight, they're done, Foster said without hesitation. We'll let legal handle their dismissals. But make no mistake, we don't get to hide behind policy anymore. Not when the person who owns the sky just took it back. Back on the plane, the intercom crackled once more, and a new voice spoke. Ladies and gentlemen, a younger flight attendant announced, clearly nervous but composed. This is First Officer Shaw speaking on behalf of the remaining crew. We acknowledge the events that have taken place. We are continuing service for the remainder of the flight under direct oversight. Water, coffee, and light snacks will be served momentarily. We appreciate your patience and your courage. The words, while brief, carried meaning. They weren't rehearsed. They weren't company safe. They were real, and for once, the truth didn't need to shout to be heard. As the cabin lights dimmed slightly for the late evening hours, Gloria remained seated, her expression unreadable, but her presence radiated certainty. Not vengeance, not pride, just certainty that something long dormant had finally stirred, and it wouldn't go back to sleep. Agent Greer checked his email and found 5 internal reports waiting for his approval, each marked priority. Graves initiated compliance review. He smiled to himself and whispered, "You're rewriting the rules, ma'am." Rachel Amara typed furiously at her laptop, already framing the article's lead. She boarded in silence. She left with the movement. When Flight 722 touched down at O'Hare International just after midnight, the runway lights streaking like silent witnesses to what had transpired in the skies above. A small convoy of vehicles already waited near the hangar gate. No one spoke as the jet taxied to a private receiving terminal typically reserved for diplomats or security transfers. But tonight, it served a different purpose. Gloria didn't stand until the seatbelt light blinked off. Even then, she moved with the same measured grace, her cane tapping lightly against the aisle floor, her expression calm but firm. As she approached the front, Darla stood in the galley, eyes rimmed red, her posture stiff with defiance muted by dread. She looked like someone waiting for a verdict she already knew was coming. 2 federal agents entered the aircraft and quietly requested that Darla, Captain Evans, and Flight Manager Nolan disembark with them. They complied without resistance, their once authoritative walk now reduced to quiet submission. Gloria said nothing as they passed. She didn't need to. Her silence echoed louder than any reprimand. Outside the plane, Agent Greer handed off a sealed file to an arriving compliance team. "Confirmed disciplinary history for Mason," he said. "I believe we'll find this wasn't her first incident, just the first one caught." 3 hours later, the findings surfaced. Darla Mason had received 2 prior complaints for racially charged language and 1 formal warning for excessive force during a passenger removal. Those records had been buried by a sympathetic supervisor. Captain Evans had failed to report them, and Rachel Nolan had signed off on closed reviews without notifying HR. With that, the legal team at Atlantic Sky issued permanent termination notices for all 3, citing gross misconduct, breach of ethics, and violations of both FAA and internal policy. Their certifications were flagged for revocation by the National Aviation Standards Board. None would work in aviation again, but that was only the beginning. In the following days, Gloria appeared at a press conference hosted by the Department of Transportation and the Civil Aviation Oversight Board. She stood at the podium not as a victim, not even as a corporate executive, but as a citizen tired of watching institutions protect the very behaviors they claim to condemn. She spoke with clarity and resolve, detailing her experience, her silent audits over the past 10 years, and her reasons for never stepping forward until now. The room was packed: journalists, CEOs, pilots, flight attendants, victims, advocates, policymakers. "Let this be the last time silence is more powerful than truth," she said. "Let this be the last time someone's worth is measured by how quietly they endure mistreatment. And let this industry understand, justice doesn't land softly. It descends." The impact was immediate. Within a week, Atlantic Skies Board announced a sweeping policy overhaul. A new clause was added to every employee contract. Any proven act of discriminatory conduct, verbal, physical, or implied, would result in immediate suspension and full review by an independent civilian ethics council. If the act endangered, humiliated, or harmed a passenger, the matter would be referred directly to law enforcement for criminal investigation. A new internal division was formed, the Passenger Equity Task Force, chaired by Gloria Graves herself. Other airlines took notice. The FAA endorsed the policy. The Department of Justice praised the company's response as a model for modern accountability. But beyond policy, something larger happened. A shift, a reckoning. Airports began receiving waves of calls, letters, and emails from passengers sharing their own stories, moments they were told to be quiet, to move, to submit. Stories that once ended in silence were now finding new ground in light. 2 weeks after the incident, the International Aviation Association invited Gloria to attend the Global Flight Ethics Summit in Zurich. They didn't know she would speak. She wasn't on the agenda. But when she walked onto that stage in a navy dress and silver brooch shaped like a rising phoenix, the room rose to its feet. She was given the first ever Honorary Steward of Integrity Award, recognizing her for transforming the sky into a place where dignity flies first. During her speech, she paused for a moment, then said, "When I was struck on that flight, I felt the pain not just of a hand, but of a history. But when I stood my ground, I didn't do it alone. Every silent witness who finally spoke, every camera that turned on, every voice that said, 'This isn't right,' they stood with me. This wasn't my story. It was ours." Back in the US, the CNN piece written by Rachel Amara went viral under the title, "The Woman Who Owned the Sky: How Gloria Graves Made Airlines Accountable." School curriculums began including her story in ethics classes. Aviation academies used the case in training simulations. Passengers began asking more questions, speaking up more often, because now they knew what was possible. Justice was no longer an abstract hope, it was policy. It was precedent. It was personal. And as Gloria sat alone one evening weeks later, looking out a floor-to-ceiling window in her Chicago office, watching the contrails of jets scribble silver streaks across the fading sky, she allowed herself one quiet breath of peace. She had not fought for attention. She had fought for change. And this time, change had answered. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more powerful, real-world inspired dramas like this one. Which part of the story hit you the hardest? Was it when Gloria revealed her true identity, or when justice finally came for Darla and the crew? And tell us, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments. We'd love to know. Your voice matters, and your engagement helps more people discover stories that challenge injustice and inspire change.